I'm Austin Lugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about last year at Marienbad.
In the words of Apostle Paul to Timothy, for God did give us a
And this
spirit
week
of
we
fear.
watched The Last Year in Marienbad, which I feel is probably a very different experience than next week's film.
Well, honestly, Magic Spot, it's a more complicated movie than you think it'll be, I think.
Really? Okay.
I think so, yeah. It really is like an intelligent film. Just like last year at Marienbad is a very intelligent, very intellectual film. Obviously, there are different approaches, but
Mhm.
yeah.
When I was watching this film, sometimes when we watch films for the podcast, I worry I'm not gonna have a whole lot to say. Not because there isn't a whole lot to say about a film like this. It's just it's one of those films that's kind of hard to talk about because it is so much leaning on the visual medium. I think a lot of the story, the plot, the dialogue, it's definitely more of a poem than perhaps a traditional narrative,
Yeah, there's not really a story or plot.
which is doesn't make for a bad film. I think we do this thing in film, which is weird because in literature, right, you have poetry, you have narrative fiction, you have narrative nonfiction, right? You have all these different genres, you have all these different categories, and they're kind of their own thing. But when it comes to films, yeah, you have your action genre or your art house genre or your horror genre, but it feels like all movies kind of have to fit in this much similar box than I think we allow films to do. And so getting someone to watch a film like this who doesn't already sort of have a deep love of films, not that they wouldn't like it. I think anyone watching this film who's willing to put in the time and the effort in this film, because it is a film that does take a lot of effort. I think they would
Yeah.
enjoy it, but I think there'd be a lot of people who'd be turned off by the idea of the film because it does act more as a poem than it does a typical narrative because it's much more interested in the evoking feelings. When I took my poetry class in college, because I was required to take one poetry class to graduate, we talked about how, and I think this is how this film works, and there are a lot of great films like this where it's not about the story. It's more about the language which invokes feelings. In this case, when I say language, I don't mean literally language, but more the visual images, right? They're evoking a very specific feelings. And that is sort of how you experience this piece. You are constantly being shown these different images. It has this way of diluting time as if time doesn't really exist in this traditional sense, and they're all trapped in this one place. Of course, the first film that I thought of when I was watching this film was, of course, the work of Luis Buñuel, who plays with time a
Yeah.
lot, and his films are definitely kind of strange. But there's another film that I was thinking of when I watched this, and I
I
can't
think I thought of
remember.
like Inland Empire. Lynch's
Inland
Inland
Empire
Empire
is
is another
another
one
great
that I thought
example.
of. Like
Just
that's more contemporary example.
yeah, just this idea of living outside of time in this weird way where everyone's sort of trapped and they're running in circles. And I think that that's what a lot of this film is about. You'll notice that they repeat lines of dialogue over and over again. Of course, the opening, which goes on
Uh-huh.
for quite a while, they're just pushing from room to room.
Yeah.
He's basically repeating the same lines over and over
Uh-huh.
again for the first several minutes. And it creates this hypnotic sense in this film. And what's strange about this film is I knew when I talked about this film, I feel like I'm going to describe it in a way that it sounds very boring or repetitive, but I found the film to be very hypnotic. It lulls you into this weird
Yeah.
sense of you yourself lose a sense of time. Like you can't really grasp how long you've been in this movie. I remember about halfway into the movie, I had to pause because I had to go to the bathroom or some shit. And the fact that I was halfway through the movie, like it didn't really click for me because it didn't feel like the halfway point in the movie. There's like no way to figure out where you are in the movie because again,
Yeah.
it's not following that traditional narrative structure. You can't say, okay, here's act one, here's act two, here's scene six of whatever. And so you're just constantly in this weird state of you're trying to figure out what's going on. And it is a film that makes you work. It definitely makes you think. You're trying to figure out who is this person? How are they related to that person? what's going on, what's real, what's imagined, because it's sort of coming in the perspective of this guy who's, I guess, fallen in love with a married woman. Is that, am I getting the gist of it?
We don't know. Like we don't know their names. We don't really know like the relationship between the woman and the other man. That could be her husband. It's never really said.
Unclear. All of their relationships are unclear. Again, it's not that it's vague, it's very specific, but it will play multiple different versions of the same story simultaneously. And it won't say this one's the real one or that one's the real one. And he even plays into this idea of memory. I think memory is a big part of this film, as if just the very idea of memory is right. Memory isn't something that's solid. It's not something that just exists. It's not the past. The memory is something that is constantly evolving and changes with our current perception of the world. And of course, every time he meets her, he says, "Don't you remember the last time we met? Don't you remember the last time we did this?" And it's always him telling her about this thing. And of course, it's shaped by his own memory. And she never remembers every time she meets him. It's always this new experience, and she's always confused by it. And he's always having to explain to her, you don't remember this thing, and this thing happened. But it's always being reshaped and changed. And even towards the end, we see him purposely changing his memory. I think towards the beginning, perhaps the change of memory is accidental to a certain degree, but the further we into the piece, the more purposeful the change becomes, as if he himself is manipulating time, as if memory in and of itself is something that can be changed. And when we change our memory, we're changing the past. And so the actual outcome becomes different too.
Like memory is an extremely fallible thing. So I think yeah, like the point is that it's like we're led to believe that like this couple had met like a year ago, right? Like that's the idea of the movie, right? If you had to
Yeah.
like put a crux into it, this couple met a year ago here, and they agreed that they once they meet again, they would like go off with each other a year later. Did this couple actually meet? Is he confusing her for someone else? Did she actually forget? Is she pretending to forget? All these questions are completely unanswered because it doesn't really necessarily matter. It's more about like this movie is like more about kind of like the architecture of the cinematic medium than anything else. You kind of have to like approach it at a sort of like vibrational level rather than kind of like if you're like someone who like grew up, watching like conventional commercial narrative films, which most people have, especially if you're like an American person. Maybe if you're French, yeah, like maybe they play like last year in Marienbad at like in school or whatever, in kindergarten. They're like, this is our culture, and it's like okay. And and if you've watched all these like commercial movies and that's what you grew up with and you've seen a bunch of them and you get it and you watch Last Year in Marienbad, it can either be a mystifying experience in which you were just kind of like completely like dismiss it, you hate it, you think it's shitty. On the Wikipedia, they have a line from like a Pauline Kael interview. Pauline Kael, the former New York critic for the New Yorker,
Yeah.
said the high fashion experimental film, The Snow Job at the Ice Palace, back at the no fun party for non people. She didn't like it very much. She has to be she's such an asshole about it. So yeah, you can dismiss it and it's like pretentious, it's shitty, it's stupid, it doesn't make any sense. Or you can accept it, approach it, at a again at a very kind of like sonic vibrational level, sort of try to like, sort of move with it, and it can be a very kind of like freeing experience. Wow, I'm free of the conception. I'm free of the formal narrative arcs that every movie has to for some reason have, right? It doesn't have to have anything. Like a movie can be anything. It doesn't have to be like a story that has a beginning, middle, and an end. It doesn't have to have like, a climax, or it doesn't have to have like a dialogue that makes sense, or characters with names. It doesn't have to have like a realistic depiction of time, memory, that you can kind of like follow along with, right? It doesn't need any of that stuff. A lot of movies do use these things because it's easy for people to pick up. For an audience, it's able to, these signifiers, these things identify very easily with general audiences. But Marienbad, it completely pushes away all those things and instead opts for a completely different vision of what a movie could be. It's very much a good thing.
I think what a lot of people will find challenging with this film, which is kind of what you're getting into here, is you kind of just have to be willing to let go. You can't come in with any sort of bias or expectations. I think the moment you start looking for those traditional aspects, right? Those things that you grab onto when you watch a movie, you're gonna lose in this experience. And it's purposefully playing with these things. It knows that you're going into this. I mean, this is a film, of course, there's a reason, right? That this film opens on a play, and a play makes a
Yeah.
big part of this film because it is talking about the way that we present things, and it knows that it is playing with the way that you see things, just like in a play itself, right? They're playing with reality isn't really reality. And a play is very interesting, especially when there's a play within a film, because the weird thing about a play that's different than a movie is I think what kinds of help us with a film is there's the purposeful facade of, right, the two-dimensionality of a film. We know that it's fake, but of course with a play you have real people on a stage, and so the sense of artificiality has to be recreated, right? You almost have to expose that this isn't real because it's so close to reality because these are real actors on a real stage, on a real set, right there in front of you. And in this film, at the very beginning, of course, the way they open the film, right? They do the thing that you do when you're on a set, right? You call action and suddenly everyone's moving, and then suddenly everyone stops, everyone freezes, and then suddenly they're moving again because he wants to make it very clear that this is artificial. This isn't real. You are moving into this cinematic world that is playing with your imagination and the way that you see the world. And it
Hmm.
doesn't exist in the real world. And you need to buy into that because if you can't buy into that, then nothing else will work, which is why I think that super long opening, where not really a whole lot happens.
Yeah.
We're kind of just pushing through the hotel. And then you have that moment where you see all of them and they're kind of
Hmm.
pausing and starting and pausing and starting. I think
Yeah.
it, under the hand,
They're talking about they're having like conversations about nothing, like,
yeah,
and
they're
we're
completely
constantly like
arbitrary.
listening, like what's, and we're kind of, yeah, we're kind of like listening to like what's going on, what's the clue, what's the idea, you know what I mean? It's like there's no clue, there's no ideas, there's
There's
nothing
nothing
going on.
there. And it's a really hard thing to sort of grasp, especially
Yeah.
as a storyteller, as a writer, as a filmmaker, because you're always telling yourself, oh, this scene always has to move forward, right? So what I'm always telling my students is every time you write dialogue, every line of dialogue, it has to move the story forward. It has to be about something, right? Someone has to want something and they have to either get that thing or don't get that thing. But of course, in this film, even though we have a want, right? We have this guy who is trying to convince this woman that he's met her or that they're together or something to that matter. The first 10, 15, 20 minutes of this film is just kind of people sitting around talking about completely arbitrary things that have nothing to do seemingly with
Yeah.
anything. And maybe there is something that upon a rewatch or a third or fourth watch that has some connective tissue to these things. But as far as I can tell, that these conversations seem to be about
Hmm.
absolutely nothing. And they talk in circles. Like it's not only that
Yeah.
they're talking about things that don't matter. It's as if the very conversations don't really make sense. Like they just keep saying the same thing over and over again, but no one's actually saying anything. They're just saying these platitudes, these cliches, but they don't mean anything. Like they
Yeah.
and so you're
Yeah.
kind of
And yeah,
lost. Yeah.
you know, the ending has this hypnotic nature, and yet it also completely just sort of like throws you into kind of like the mansion and into this environment, and it's a completely alien environment, you know, where there's nothing, an alien, not in a kind of like alien makes it seem almost like exotic and interesting, but it's alien and more just kind of like it's like kind of like scary, you know. It's like this movie is like quite scary. It has its like fair share of kind of like the movie, because it's so off kilter in its images and its editing, like when it'll like kind of like pan,
Hmm.
like it'll pan over, like it'll the camera will be panning and a character will be at a table or something like that, and it'll pan over and that same person that you saw at the table will be like on the other side of the room in the same
Yeah.
pan, which is crazy. Like stuff like that adds this like surrealistic nature, or like of course the very famous shot where they're in the garden, obviously, where it's like the wide shot of the garden, and everybody and people are kind of like standing out there, and you see their long shadows, but then you
Yeah.
don't see the shadows of like the trees, right? So it's almost kind of like a painting, like a surrealistic painting where what you're looking at like has this like realistic but also surrealistic elements, and like kind of like also like kind of like that black and white kind of dichotomy too is in there too. So it creates like this image that's just like, what am I even like looking at? Like I might as well just like be looking at like the surface of the moon or something, you know?
Hmm.
It's so weird. So, and again, that opening, it draws you into the movie, but at the same time it completely jostles you.
Yeah. This entire film, I think Aliens is a very good description because there's this unhuman-like quality that a lot of our characters have. And you could almost describe some of these performances as wooden, but not wooden in the sense of they're not
Kind of like
giving their
Bresson.
fullest, but more in the sense of something's just not right about like the way that they talk to each other, not even just the language of themselves. I mean, literally the rhetoric of it is strange, and it's almost as if these are people who have studied the human language and have studied humans but aren't
Yeah.
quite human. I mean, no one acts the way humans are. There's that great moment where we dolly from this one room that has like a group of people. They're like sitting around, and I think it dollies to a group of men playing cards or something. And right after it does that dolly shot, it repeats the dolly shot. And when you repeat the dolly
Yeah.
shot, suddenly like these people are laughing again. Like there's this artificiality to it, as if like you're watching, you're watching a film, and they know that they're in a film, and yet no one's like looking at the camera and saying like, "Oh, you're watching a movie." And I think somehow there's like this weird dissonance where it feels like these are actors in a film, but no one's recognizing that they're actors in a film. And so they're pretending to do all these things, and suddenly they're laughing or they're crying and they're jumping from all these different emotions, but there's no logic to it. There's no reason. There's no sort of movement from one thing to the other. It's just suddenly it's so jarring
There's no
because
passion. Yeah.
no, yeah. And it's haunting. I mean, the way that they laugh in this film, it has this deadness to it. The way that they look at each other, these moments of love or passion seem to lack any sort of human
Yeah.
emotion. And so they're evoking emotions, and yet it never feels like any of the actors are actually feeling these emotions, which I think is a very challenging thing to do well because you have to give simultaneously a quote unquote wooden performance, and yet it has to evoke the nature of these things. And so, as a viewer, at least for me, I felt very uncomfortable, and I perhaps scary is the right word because you never feel right in this film. You never feel as if you can be with them, and yet what's weird is you would think this would create a sense of distance between the viewer and the film itself, right? As if we're putting up the layers of this wall that separate us from it. But I found myself always sort of very close to these characters. I think perhaps part of that is because we never leave the hotel. I mean, the only time we ever leave the hotel is when we're outside of the hotel. And the outside world, Earth, feels completely unreal. I mean, you talk about those moments where you have those shots of outside that look like surreal paintings. Like something isn't right about this image. Something just doesn't work right. Like the way the trees are just perfectly built, or the way that nature itself doesn't look like nature. Everything has this artificiality to it. Nothing looks real, and there's the decadence of the inside, the decadence of all the beautiful dresses that the women wear or all the amazing suits that everyone wears, and yet simultaneously there never seems to be like the decadence of food or alcohol. Like they're always, you never see them doing
Not
normal,
really.
right, human things. Like the only thing they ever seem to be doing is playing cards or just sitting around talking. They're never actually doing
They play
anything.
Nim. They play a lot of Nim.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of Bresson a little bit, although Rene's and Bresson likes their philosophy and their kind of their actor, like Bresson uses like non-actors, of course, to act statically. And so and he kind of does that same thing in his movies where he with that and other elements as well. He kind of like reins in kind of like this tendency for movies to have like all this emotion and just just amazing moments, so that like when the movie ends, it ends on just kind of like this sort of bittersweet tone, right? Like Pickpocket, Man Escaped, Ahuzar, Balthazar. Like these movies are so, there's not a lot of like overacting. Everybody kind of acts like, like I think he would call them mannequins or something like that, or models. Actually, is the word he used. But Renee like does it a little bit differently in this movie, where these are like not. These are like actors,
Yeah.
right? Like these are like obviously like trained professional like actors, and so they're
Hmm.
acting in this like peculiar way of that. So it kind of creates, I wouldn't say like Bresson's movies are like scary. They're more like sad and melancholy, and that's obviously like an emotion that you could attribute to Marienbad, but it also is kind of like foreboding and scary, and kind of like if you feel like and I think too, like whether you're the viewer or whether you're like the viewers trying to empathize with the characters, you feel kind of like this sense of like no control either with his movies, with Marienbad in particular. And again, like it kind of also like kind of goes back to that sense of memory of like even us like sitting here kind of talking about Marienbad, right? We're kind of going based off the memory
Hmm.
of our movie. I watched it like a couple nights ago. You probably watched it very recently too. And even
Yeah.
that's failable. Even that could be wrong. We could be like misremembering the movie, right? It kind of like goes back around to kind of like this, like kind of like we're sort of like completely dependent upon our memory, but like forgetting is a big part of memory. And in fact, it's important to the fabric of our lives, like forgetting things. If we didn't forget things, like we wouldn't be able to do anything at all. So yeah, Marienbad is like more all about that. Bresson movies don't really like do much about memory. They're more about like more about like tactile things, like more kind of like in the material world. While Marienbad kind of operates in kind of like this sort of like imaginary kind of like worlds, imaginary kind of intellectual world, right? Architectural world. Even like the even something as like clear as kind of like the hallways or the configuration of like a building on the inside or outside of it isn't really like clear. It isn't even that is even that is sort of I guess even that could be wrong.
Yeah, the way this hotel seems to be built doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I was thinking about this idea of memory and how films and of themselves, we experience them in the moment. And of course, in that moment, they have a particular experience. But really, when we talk about, this is my favorite movie, this is the movie I love, what we're really talking about is our memory of that film, the feelings that we have, re-evoking these feelings. And he's kind of playing with that because the very idea of remembering a film, like the reason you remember a film, and typically you remember the narrative structure. That's what helps people remember things, right? It's the reason, the like right those professional memory people, the way they are able to memorize, 1,000 numbers or whatever absurd amount of things is because they
Mhm.
utilize narrative structure. And so in a film like this, even
Yeah.
even just thinking about the film, which for me, I watched
Hmm.
it almost a week ago now, right? So there are certain aspects that I remember really well, but honestly,
Hmm.
except for very specific things, I don't know if I could tell you in the order that these events happened. I mean, I know that the moment where she supposedly is shot or killed or she falls onto the bed, I know that's towards the end. And I know it opens with the pushing in of the moving into the hotel and that kind of frozen moment. But all these other moments in the film, I don't know if I could tell you which one happened first and which one happened second. So the film in and of itself
Yeah.
is is recognizing that we experience film more as a memory than we actually do the film itself. Because even if it's your favorite film of all time and you've seen it a dozen times, you spend a lot more time thinking about the film. You spend most of your time in the memory of a film than you actually do in the experience of the film itself. And so the very process of remembering the film fundamentally changes the film itself, especially a film like this. And then the thing that sticks out to me, like the thing that I remember most about this film, despite all these beautiful images and just all these strange moments, are the moments when they play that game, the 7-5-3-1.
That's called Nim.
And no matter, I don't know why it's so exciting to watch them play this because it's a very simple game.
Because you're
The
just
idea,
like, because like you want him to beat you want the guy to be beaten,
you want
and
to
he
be beat.
keeps winning. He's like unbelievably good at it. Yeah. And again, like that, like the game of Nim, that game is like a game of like mathematics and architecture and stuff like that. Like it's like that game is like free from, kind of like the movie, that game is like free of any kind of like narrative or politics or philosophy or psychology, maybe a little bit of psychology, but ultimately it's just all about mathematics, right? It's just all about like, whether you go first or I go first. Like it's all just about like picking the right pieces at the right time. I guess there is like that element of like maybe predicting what the person is maybe going to do after you play. Again, even me trying to like explain it, it's going kind of like in this kind of this kind of like formal circle, kind of like how the movie does that, where it kind of it has this sort of architecture to it, and yet it's just never ever clear, right? It's entirely complex, but it's all imaginary.
Yeah, and that's kind of the only sort of fascia that holds this film together is we see them play Nim multiple times. And the first time they play it, you're just understanding how the game works. You're like, oh, okay, this is how the game works. Here's how you grab the pieces. And so as a viewer, you're like, okay, here's what I would do, right? Here's my strategy. Here's how I'd figure it out. And by the second or third time, you're like, oh, of course, he's always going second. So it must be if you go first, then you will lose,
Yeah.
right? But then he goes
Yeah.
first, and you're like, fuck, that's not it.
And then he beats him again.
And he beats him again,
Right.
and
It's like,
he
how
beats
is
him
he
again.
doing it?
And he's like, and you can't figure,
But
like
and
as a viewer,
there's never like a chess movie moment where it's
no,
like, aha, like I figured it out.
you can never figure it out. And there's that great moment where he's playing and everyone's watching around, and then after they play, they're like, "Oh, it's clearly a mathematic
Mhm.
problem." And one guy's like, "No, it's a philosophical problem, or it's like a psychological, right?" Just like you're talking
Yeah.
about. And you're like,
Yeah.
"Well, what
Yeah.
is it like?" And just like the film itself, it's never really clear how he always wins because it feels in many ways like a game of complete chance. Just like this film, like it feels as if
Mhm.
all of these things that are happening are completely random and they're not connected. And yet, you know, by watching him play the game, that it can't be a game of chance because he can't just never lose like by chance. Like there has to be some skill
Yeah.
here. And yet we can't figure out what it is. We don't know why it is that no matter what he does, right? No matter what row he picks from first, no matter what row his opponent picks from first, no matter who goes first, he always wins, and there's no way around it. There's no way to escape it. Just like the film itself is completely inescapable. You can never leave this hotel. You can never
It's
go
like a
outside of
prison.
this
It's a
place.
it's a
It
fucking
is.
prison. We're in a hellish kind of like a Divine Comedy-esque prison, 7 layers of hell type shit.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that perhaps a year ago, or perhaps some time earlier, another film that I was reminded of while watching this was I'm thinking of ending things because that too has this sort of
I
weird
guess, yeah.
circularity to it. Of course, there's that moment late in the film where he's been handing her like this photo, right, to prove that this was you, this happened, this really happened. And there's that moment where she opens the drawer, which is a really haunting moment. She opens that drawer, and there's thousands of this exact same picture. And perhaps an argument could be made that she is in some sort of purgatory, right? She has wronged her husband, she wronged someone, and now she.
You could say both. You could say both of them are in purgatory because like obviously it hints at her being shot, and it also has that moment where he like falls off the balcony or something like that. So I mean, you could posit that like both these characters are like ghosts that are in forever trapped in the mansion purgatory or whatever, and they haunt it forever or whatever. I don't think it's necessarily making any kind of like moral equivalency about her
I don't
wronging her
think
husband
so.
or anything like
No.
that. It could just be like the deaths, like him shooting her or whatever. These could just be, figments,
Hmm.
metaphors, dreams, imaginary things. Like there's that, or like remembering this, but really it was like this. One of the most interesting parts of the movie, in my opinion, By the way, this movie was written by so the movie was directed by Alain Resnais, but the movie was written by a guy named Robe Grillet, and he was like a famous French novelist guy, and he like wrote this movie and stuff like that, and he kind of had like a fascination with like kind of like sex and like BDSM and stuff like that. Renee didn't really have that, so the movie's kind of interesting because it does. I've read some stuff about it as to how like their competing visions, I guess you could say, is
Mm.
kind of interesting. And I guess Robe Grillet like wanted to put like a rape scene in the movie, like straight up.
Oh
And
shit.
Renee only kind of like gives an impression of it. He doesn't really put the full scene in there, which is fine with me.
Yeah.
It doesn't, neither here nor there. But yeah, there's like that scene in the bedroom where they kind of like talk about like the kind of like the force, right?
Hmm.
The force of it, right? Like him like forcing her, right? Raping her. And then it like cuts to that amazing scene where she like has like her arms wide open and it's like repeatedly like as
Pushing
if you're
in.
flying into the arms of her and it's
Yeah.
like and she's like blown out like she's like super like white from like the light and stuff like that really interesting kind of like push and pull of like I remember it like this, but you remember it like this. Like I thought our relationship was like this, but it turns out like this person remembers it like this, right? That kind of like he said, she said kind of like, relationship thing, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah. And that's one of the few overarching pieces, something that goes throughout the piece is him
Yeah.
constantly, and he's not even really trying to convince
Badgering her.
her, but he's almost trying to convince himself that he didn't do this thing, that he
Yeah.
didn't and we,
Persuasion is a
yeah,
big part of the movie.
and we can't tell. We don't know if this was a case of rape, or if they did have a loving embrace, or if they've never even met each other and have no idea who
Yeah.
she is, and he's just mistaking her for someone else, or he's just created this
Hmm.
fantastical vision that he's living in this dream world, and he's created this dream version of her, and perhaps you could argue that he has created a fantasy, right? A fantasy of a woman. And so the reason that he's never met this real woman is because this real woman doesn't actually exist, right? He's just as like people fantasize about the partner, right? The idea of the ideal partner. They spend their entire life looking for the ideal partner, and he spends his entire life fantasizing about
Yeah.
what she is. And so every time he meets her, he's not actually talking about her. He's talking about his own image of her, his idea of what she should be, of what she
Hmm.
should look like, of how she should act. But she's never actually that person, or she can never be that person, because no one can be that person, because you're imagining a thing that can't exists. But again,
Hmm.
it's unclear because this is a film. Yeah.
And but it almost seems like by the end she seems like partly like when she talk when they start talking, he's like, "Hey, remember when we did it?" And she was just like, no." She kind of is sort of like flippant, and she's like, "Leave me alone." And by the time the movie ends, like there's like moments in Shades where it feels like she does remember, or she's maybe been convinced into thinking that this actually did happen, even though it maybe didn't happen to her. Or maybe she did forget and now she's remembering. Again, these things are completely unclear. It's more just kind of about kind of like, just like the nature of memory in general, right? It encapsulates all these problems into just one, a relationship, one occurrence, I guess.
Yeah. And we've been talking over and over again about this idea of memory. And I think one thing we don't often think about when we consider memory, and something that he's playing with here, as you also pointed out earlier, is that memories aren't just the things that happened, or we misremember what happened, but memory can also be something that we put into someone's mind, right? We can have someone, if we tell someone enough that this thing happened, we can literally change their memory. We can change the way that a person thinks. We can,
I think that's called gaslighting. I think that's
yeah.
like the
And that's pretty much, I mean, you could argue perhaps that's something that's happening here too, is he is
yeah.
convincing her that this thing has happened, or that thing happened, or it happened this specific way. And now by the end of the film, it's kind of in her head, and we don't know, and we're kind of living in this world where we don't know what's real, we don't know what's not, because there's nothing to hold on to, right? It's not like a film like Memento, where, okay, this one's in color, this one's in black and white, this one's in sepia. We can tell what's happening when. In this film, everything's sort of jumbled together, and you can't say, this is the
Uh-huh.
real thing that's happening, this is the false thing. And whatever you try to
Yeah.
argue, whatever argument you try to make about this film, whether you argue it's a film about rape, or you argue it's a film about purgatory, or you argue it's a film about memory, whatever your argument is, it can always be contradicted by something else in this film. You can be
Hmm.
like, okay, you think it's this, but then how do you explain this scene? It's a film full of contradictions. And what's weird
Hmm.
is it works perfectly, even though like there's
Yeah.
these things that shouldn't it's playing into our own idea of cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance is the idea that
Mhm.
we can believe two things that are completely opposite to each other and can believe them simultaneously and know that they're opposite and know that they're conflicting ideas, and yet we believe them both equally and still, despite knowing that they can't both be true. And that's exactly what this film is doing, where we're watching conflicting things. Conflicting stories are being told that can't both be true. And yet somehow as a viewer, we're like, but they're all true. They're all part of this story, the fascia, the muscle, the
Yeah,
tendons
there's
of
no
this
real
piece.
truth.
It's just it's all real and it's all not. And so it's a very strange world to just be part of.
And yeah, and again, like Renee and like Rob Gurley, like they achieve this because they completely reject any kind of like formal storytelling techniques that would make the movie like somewhat decipherable like any other Hollywood movie, right? And so again, like people I could understand would dismiss or reject this movie because again, it doesn't give them any like one it doesn't give them really any kind of like narrative truths like it actually did happen like this or it actually happened like that, and like there's no it completely avoids any kind of this concept of the truth, that there is a truth to be told, that the mystery will be solved, right? The whole movie is a mystery. It is the mystery, right? Like the actual crux of the movie isn't that the what is the I guess the truth to the mystery. The mystery is, the movie is all about the mystery. And we're submerged in it, and we just kind of have to take it for what it is, instead of like sitting through a movie worrying about like, is this true or is this not? Obviously, we are going to be thinking about these things as we're watching the movie, but by the end, if you're unsatisfied because you wish, you actually found out what actually did happen, then you kind of miss the point a little bit, right? Like, and again, I can understand why some people might get frustrated by it because again, it doesn't spoon feed you this what people want, which is, they want like they want emotion, they want passion, they want to know what happens in the end, like people, and then that's fine. It's just I don't think but again, movies like this are brave because they dare to defy those conventions, and instead like opt for something that is way more out there.
I think any viewer would find it frustrating if they go into this film, like they go into most films, looking for an answer. I mean, if you argue like, okay, this film is a mystery and therefore it needs to be solved, then you are going to have a miserable experience because our filmmakers here, our director, our writer, everyone really involved in this piece, they're not interested in answering that question. And if you go into this film trying to find the answer, right, you're trying to explain this film. If you go in it from a completely logical state of being, you're like, okay, this is the thing that's happening. Here's the plot. Here's the story. Here's the
Mhm.
structure. Here's what's really going on. If you spin the piece trying to do that, you're going to have a miserable experience because you're missing the point of this. The point of this is that the world is illogical. The world doesn't make sense. This is where Dadaism and then of course surrealism, which came from Dadaism, comes from, is this idea and acceptance that the world doesn't make sense, that people don't do things because it's logical, that's not the way people work. That's not the way the world works. The fact is that the world is full of just these nonsensical things that are happening, and it's the very idea of trying to make sense of it that destroys us. That's the thing that makes us miserable. And that's the thing that would make any viewer miserable, is if you come into this film and you're like, I'm going to try to understand this film. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to watch this film, and I'm going to go write a 20-page paper on this is why this film is about XYZ. You're going to have a miserable experience because it can't be understood, because it is just like, looking at those surreal paintings. You can say, oh, well, what they're saying is they're talking about, the trauma of World War I, or they're talking about this thing or that thing. But at the end of the day, like, no, they're not talking about anything. They're making fun of the very fact that you're trying to find me. Like the irony of course, the surrealist movement back in the 19 the teens and the 20s is that the whole movement was supposed to be unexplainable, and immediately people were trying to explain the movement, and here's how the movement works, and here's how this works. And that's exactly what's happening with this film too, of course, of a different era, but it's going off these same ideas. It's This film can't be understood, and by that, people will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain it, trying to understand. I'm sure you can go on to a dozen different websites, and they'll say this is what this
Yeah.
movie is about. Here's the real thing that's about. But the moment you try to explain, when you're like, here, the moment you grab at something, you say, this is what the film is about, you've lost the magic of the film. And the point of the film is that it can't be understood, it can't be explained. You are supposed to be lost in this world that doesn't make sense. It's completely illogical. And you have to be okay with that. You have to accept that. You have to just be part of this world and just be willing to live in it for 95 minutes. And if you can't do that, if you can't live in that world, if you try to explain, if you try to understand, if you try to use logic to justify the things in this film, you're just going to be miserable.
To a small extent, I guess I kind of disagree because I think I agree with you that like the movie itself isn't trying to like necessarily say like one thing or another, isn't trying to say like one thing, right? It's not like easily understandable, but I think because it's not necessarily about anything understandable, it's about a lot of different things, you know? And I think like our interpretations of it can sort of like create a fuller understanding of the movie. You know, I think like I think making the attempt to maybe try to like pull some meaning out of the movie is a worthy endeavor to do. I would never ever tell a person like, "Oh yeah, like if you try to like explain this or that in last year in Marienbad, you don't even try." You know, like but like I think it's worthy to try. I think it's like a worthy project. And just because like the world is like nonsensical, can be definitely nonsensical. It's quite nonsensical and it's quite, just, chaotic. I think it would be suicidal to not try to at least like make sense of it in some kind of like way, despite the limitations of our language and our brains. I think it's a worthy cause to continue to find out what the purpose is and what the solutions are and things like that. And but again, that's why Marrying Bad is so good, is because I think again a person can either look at it and again, like I said earlier, a person can watch it who was raised on commercial films and think like this sucks, or you can look at it and instead think, wow, this is liberating. I can put myself over the movie. I can instead put myself into the movie instead of like the movie being separate from me. I can instead sort of like interpret it and move it and form it and sort of play with its architecture how I please. And instead of just like being a movie in which you're just kind of like, being spoon fed like the same type of story that you have seen before. Marvel movies, Star Wars movies, they all kind of do this. So yeah, that's how I look at it.
Yeah, and I don't think I necessarily disagree. The meaning is the big part of this, and not that there isn't meaning. I think there's a lot of meaning in this film, but this is a film that allows you, that I can take my meaning of this film, and you can take your meaning of this film, and I guess to a certain extent you can
Mhm.
do this with any film, but I think much more with a film like this is, what I take from this film is completely authentic, and what you take is completely authentic, even if they're completely contradictory things, because this is a film that allows you to experience it the way you experience
Mhm.
it. Again, I talk about this idea how this film is about memory, and films themselves, they are memories. We exist mostly with films in a memory. I mean, most of the time, I'd argue for most people, including myself, who's someone who's seen literally thousands of movies, most films I've only seen once. Maybe I've seen, there's probably only a couple dozen films I've seen twice. A very few films I've seen more than twice. And so films that even I love, they exist almost entirely in my memory. They don't exist in reality. They're not something that I'm constantly watching. I think that's how it's different than a song, because anytime you want to listen to a song, you just go and you listen to it. And so yeah, it kind of takes place in memory, but especially because we have such large access to a song now, it's so easy for me to find any song I want to listen to. Whereas with a movie, because that's a 2 hour experience, you're not going to go and watch that same movie every single day. You don't have 2 hours every day to watch that movie.
Yeah, I wouldn't watch a movie every single day, but there are some movies I've watched quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're a freak. You've watched movies, many, many more times than maybe I've seen a lot of movies. But even then, most of the
Yeah.
time that movie exists in a memory. And so now when
Yeah.
I think back
Mhm.
to, and of course, it's still fresh in my mind, and we're talking about the film. So the amount of things that I remember about the last year of Marienbad is a lot more than maybe if I go and listen to this episode of the podcast a year from now. What I remember about that film will be fundamentally different. I mean, if we went and talked about a film that maybe we did really early in the podcast, right? One of the first podcasts that we did for the show without rewatching the film and just talked about it from our memory, I think that conversation would be completely different than the original conversation
Yeah.
we had. And not just because we have changed as people, we're older, we're wiser, blah, 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 but because our memories are constantly changing and the way we see the film itself is changing. And so even the way I'm experiencing the film now is different than how I experienced the film when I watched it. And it's gonna be a week from now and 5 weeks from now and 3 years from now. And that experience is gonna constantly change. And that's what's so
Mhm.
strange about Marienbad is your meaning of that film without you rewatching it can change in a way that I don't think you can with a lot of films. I think if you watch a traditional narrative film, your feelings towards that film, the way you experience that film isn't going to change that much. I think it's going to have this sort of, once you've developed this idea of this film, it's kind of this is how it is. But with this film, because there's all these different ideas, you can kind of think about I think it's a film that maybe you're right. Maybe like I don't think it's inauthentic to find me in this film, to think about this film. I think it's a film that forces you to think a lot. And I guess maybe what I'm trying to get at here is you shouldn't ever assume that you ever achieve the right answer to this, right? There's no answer to
Yeah.
this. I think it's very valuable to think about it and to find meaning in this film, but I don't think you're ever
There's no
going to
central
find
truth
the
or central
answer. Yeah,
answer.
exactly.
Yeah. 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 Well, you want to wrap it up, Austin? You're kind of wrapping it up right now, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So, I'm hitting on all those points, but this is one of the most enjoyable experiences I've had a film in quite a while. And what's strange is it's very different than what I typically love in the film. Of course, I'm someone who loves the noir. I love my musicals. I love the big, colorful, and sometimes perhaps maybe more simplistic films with the classic narrative, American structure. And I really enjoy those experiences because I can just sit down, I can laugh, I can have a good time. And there's certainly times in my life that you need that experience, that I need that experience, where it's just something easy and fun to watch. And then there are films like this, which are much more challenging. And they aren't the kind of films that you spend all day working really hard and you sit down and you watch this film. This isn't a film you just kind of turn on. This is a film that requires
Yeah.
engagement. And if you don't have the engagement in the film like this, you're not going to get the full experience of it. And that's a lot to
You
ask
can't
of
really
a
be in the
viewer.
film. Yeah.
And this is a film that I think it was a very good choice to only make this film 95 minutes. Because I think if this film was 2 hours, 2.5 hours, it would be such an
Fuck it. Why not?
exhausting experience. I mean,
Whatever.
don't get me
Like,
wrong,
who
I love
cares?
this film, but it's a film that requires so much engagement, that requires
Mhm.
it asks so much of the viewer. And I think the best of ways that it really does have to be limited in time before our viewer just becomes exhausted by the experience. I know by the end of this film, I felt like, and this is what I think defines a great film, is you feel changed in some way after you see the film. I mean, it just feels like the world just seems a little bit different than before. Like the hue of your glasses, of those rose tinted glasses, just seems like a slightly different hue than it did before. Time itself has just passed in a strange way, different than if it was just 90 minutes. Like it just feels like life itself is different. And that's what I got out of this experience. And it's so strange talking about this movie because when I was watching the film, I'm like, this is gonna be such a hard film to talk about. How am I gonna talk about this film? Because there is no classic
No,
structure. The things that we
I
usually
didn't think
talk
that at
about,
all.
the things that
No.
we traditionally talk about in this podcast, it's like you can't really grasp onto those things. It's a very hard film
Mhm.
to talk about because it lives so much in the visual medium. It lives so much in this world where, I hate to say it, but we say it all the time, right? You kind of have to watch the movie. And I think if there's ever a case of this is probably the best case of you have to watch the movie because the experience is so specific and surreal. But
Yeah.
I love everything about this film. I don't have a single complaint when it comes to film. It looks beautiful, performances are incredible. The score and the music, which we didn't even talk about, is just has this
Yeah,
like
yeah, it adds to
ethereal
the yeah.
quality to it, and
Yeah, that's to kind of like the spookiness of the movie.
the way like it'll repeat melodies, they'll just be like slightly different, but you can't tell what's different about it. Sometimes it'll be in a different key, like things that are just slightly off
Yeah.
throughout this piece. It just all comes together in this uh almost this orchestra of these different movements and ideas all coming together that just fit perfectly. So I'm gonna hit
Mhm.
it with the 10 out of 10.
Yeah, I think I was thinking 9 out of 10, but I think I'm gonna go with the 10 out of 10 as well, just because like it really is kind of like the fucking like ultimate project. Because yeah, like what's the point of like movies or cinema or whatever? Like, is it to tell like the same stories like over and over again, or to kind of like fuel to like kind of like to the need for spectacle or something like that? Like, or is it to kind of like liberate our minds? Liberate the human imagination to imagine like things outside of ourself and within ourself that we can kind of like grasp onto and really kind of like help us like understand the world much better than we do today, or at least much better than we did, maybe a few hours ago. So I think, yeah, like I think like last year in Marienbad is just kind of like that movie that just does that, right? Like it kind of reels you in and repels you at the same time. It kind of it's sort of like this contradictory film in which like a painting or a novel or a poem, it has this sort of like it operates in this manner that is that's not like happenstance. It's well constructed. It's an architectural piece, right? Like, and yet it's still somewhat chaotic, but it has like order. It's a kind of like this chaotic order to it that is really quite unusual. There's really nothing else I've seen it. I don't think I've seen anything else like this, at least from like a narrative film. There are plenty of amazing, great, wonderful, artistic, avant-garde films that go even farther and don't even have dialogue or sound or music, right? But when we're talking about like feature-length films, last year at Marienbad is like the movie that kind of like really captures that feeling. So yeah, I think I'll give it the 10 as well.
Wow. A rare moment in podcast history. Only a few
Yeah,
times have we both given 10 out of 10s. I think we've only ever done it one other time, actually. Can't exactly
I
remember what
can't.
the film
I,
was,
I, I don't remember what it
but
was.
I feel like it wasn't that long ago though either. I think it was within the last year that we gave our last 10 out, both had a 10 out of 10.
Maybe it was like Malcolm X or something like that.
Is Malcolm X. It was Malcolm X. That's right. That was the last film that we both gave
Okay.
it, which still deserved
Okay.
it of it. So that's crazy. I mean, it doesn't happen very often. It's a very exciting thing to happen on the podcast.
Not typically.
Thank you all for listening. You can find everything I do at Austin Lugo.
I'm on Letterboxd at Retro Andrew.
And you can find this podcast wherever your podcast. You also find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube with Nothing to Say. And thank you all for listening.
No fear remains.
Thanks again.